Carl Jung discovered that spiritual awakening doesn't energize you, it empties you. After studying hundreds of patients who experienced spiritual breakthroughs, Jung found that 70% lost all motivation within months, not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well at seeing through life's illusions. Jung called this the awakening paradox, the moment when enlightenment becomes emptiness, when clarity becomes confusion, when spiritual success becomes psychological crisis. You thought awakening would set you on fire with purpose. Instead, it extinguished every flame that used to drive you. Right now, you might be lying in bed wondering why nothing matters anymore, why the goals that once excited you now feel hollow, why you can't summon the energy to care about anything, even though you're more conscious than you've ever been. But Jung discovered something that changes everything. This emptiness isn't a spiritual failure. It's a psychological necessity. And there's a specific process for transforming this void into the deepest source of authentic motivation you've ever experienced. Here's what's at stake. Everything you thought you knew about motivation, purpose, and spiritual growth. You've been told that awakening leads to bliss, that consciousness brings clarity, that enlightenment ignites passion. But Jung discovered the opposite is true. The more you awaken, the more you realize that every goal you've been chasing was an illusion. Every motivation you've had was rooted in ego, fear, or social conditioning. Every dream you've pursued was someone else's definition of success projected onto your life. Jung found that spiritual awakening forces you into what he called the nigredo, the blackening phase where your old self dies, but your new self hasn't been born yet. You're stuck in psychological limbo, too conscious to go back to sleep, but not yet awake enough to know what comes next. The cost of not understanding this process is devastating. Most people think they're experiencing spiritual depression. They believe they've done something wrong, that they've lost their way, that they need to get their motivation back. But Jung warned that trying to return to old motivations after awakening is like trying to put a butterfly back in its cocoon. It's not just impossible, it's a betrayal of your own evolution. The real danger is that you'll either force yourself back into ego-driven goals that no longer fit, or you'll remain paralyzed in this emptiness forever. Neither path leads to authentic living. Jung discovered there's a third option: learning to navigate the void consciously, understanding why awakening kills motivation, and discovering how to birth entirely new forms of purpose from the ashes of your old self. Let me tell you about the patient who made Carl Jung realize that spiritual awakening could be more psychologically dangerous than sleeping through life. Her name was Maria, and she came to Jung after what she described as the most profound spiritual experience of her existence. Maria had spent years seeking enlightenment through meditation, spiritual texts, and consciousness practices. Then one day, during a particularly deep meditation, she experienced what mystics call ego death, a complete dissolution of her personal identity into universal consciousness. For weeks afterward, Maria felt euphoric. She had touched the divine. She had seen through the illusion of separation. She understood, with crystalline clarity, that everything she had previously worried about was ultimately meaningless. But then something terrifying happened. Maria couldn't get out of bed. She stopped eating. She quit her job. She ended her relationships, not out of depression, but out of a profound indifference that she couldn't explain. "I've seen the truth," she told Jung. "Nothing matters. Goals are illusions. Achievements are ego games. Love is attachment. Work is distraction. I can't pretend anymore that any of it has meaning." Jung recognized something that most spiritual teachers missed. Maria wasn't experiencing spiritual failure. She was experiencing what alchemists called the nigredo, the necessary death phase that precedes rebirth. Jung had studied alchemy extensively, understanding it not as primitive chemistry, but as a symbolic map of psychological transformation. The nigredo is the first stage where the prima materia, your old identity, must be completely dissolved before something new can emerge. But here's what Jung discovered that shocked even him. In our modern world, people can trigger the nigredo through spiritual practices without understanding what they're entering. They awaken to the emptiness of ego-driven life, but have no framework for what comes next. Jung called this premature enlightenment, accessing higher states of consciousness before developing the psychological container to integrate them. It's like performing surgery on yourself without understanding anatomy. Maria had successfully seen through the illusions that motivate most people, but she had no idea how to function in the world with this knowledge. She was psychologically homeless, too conscious to live unconsciously, but not yet integrated enough to live consciously. Jung spent months with Maria, not trying to restore her old motivations, but helping her understand that her emptiness was actually sacred. She was in the chrysalis phase of human development, the space between caterpillar and butterfly, where everything looks like formless goo. Through their work together, Jung developed what he called the individuation framework, a specific process for navigating the psychological death that spiritual awakening triggers. He realized that the nigredo wasn't a problem to be solved, but a threshold to be crossed consciously. This discovery revolutionized Jung's understanding of both psychology and spirituality. He realized that most people who seek awakening have no idea they're volunteering for psychological death and rebirth. They think they're signing up for permanent bliss, not temporary annihilation. But Jung found something remarkable. Those who learned to navigate the nigredo consciously emerged with a form of motivation so authentic and powerful that it could move mountains. They found purpose that couldn't be shaken by external circumstances because it emerged from the depths of their own being. After working with hundreds of patients experiencing post-awakening emptiness, Carl Jung made a discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about human motivation. The very process that kills your ego-driven desires is the same process that births soul-driven purpose. Jung called this the individuation paradox. You must lose yourself completely before you can find yourself authentically. But here's where most people get stuck. They think losing motivation means they're doing something wrong, when actually it means they're doing something right. Jung discovered that all human motivation falls into two categories: persona-driven and self-driven. Persona-driven motivation comes from your false self, the mask you wear to get approval, avoid rejection, and maintain social identity. This includes career ambitions, relationship goals, achievement desires, and status pursuits. Self-driven motivation comes from your authentic core, the part of you that exists beyond social conditioning and ego needs. This motivation doesn't seek external validation because it emerges from internal alignment. Here's the paradox Jung uncovered. Spiritual awakening destroys persona-driven motivation before self-driven motivation emerges. You're left in a gap where the old fuel is gone, but the new fuel hasn't appeared yet. Jung found that this gap could last anywhere from months to years, depending on how deeply you understand the process and how consciously you navigate it. Most people panic during this phase and try to artificially restart their old motivations, which Jung warned was like trying to reanimate a corpse. But Jung discovered something remarkable about patients who learned to wait consciously in the void. They began to notice subtle impulses that felt completely different from their old motivations. These weren't driven by fear, need, or external pressure. They emerged from what Jung called soul calling, authentic impulses from the deepest part of their being. Sarah, one of Jung's patients, described it perfectly. I used to be motivated by anxiety, fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough. When that motivation died after my awakening, I thought I was broken. But slowly, I started noticing different impulses. I wanted to create, not to impress anyone, but because creation felt like breathing. I wanted to help people, not to be seen as good, but because their suffering moved something deep in me. Jung realized that self-driven motivation doesn't feel like traditional motivation at all. It doesn't push or drive or demand. It calls, whispers, invites. It feels less like "I have to" and more like "I get to." It's sustainable because it comes from abundance, not scarcity. But here's what Jung found most fascinating. You can't force this new motivation to appear. You can't think your way to authentic purpose. You can only create the psychological conditions for it to emerge naturally. Jung identified 3 specific stages in this transformation: the dissolution, where old motivations die; the coagulation, where new motivations form; and the integration, where soul-driven purpose becomes your primary operating system. The problem is that most spiritual teachings skip over the psychological specifics of this process. They tell you to follow your bliss, without explaining that first, you have to consciously compost your old sense of purpose and wait in the fertilizer of uncertainty. Jung spent years developing specific techniques for navigating each stage consciously, transforming spiritual awakening from a psychological crisis into a guided rebirth. Now I'm going to reveal Carl Jung's most powerful insight about post-awakening emptiness, the realization that completely transformed how he understood human purpose and why most people never discover their authentic calling. Jung discovered that what most people call purpose is actually sophisticated ego defense. Your career goals, relationship aspirations, achievement desires. Jung found that 90% of what drives human behavior is unconscious attempts to avoid feeling inadequate, unloved, or insignificant. During his research, Jung documented a disturbing pattern. People would spend decades pursuing goals that they thought were meaningful, only to achieve them and feel completely empty. This wasn't failure. It was the inevitable result of chasing purposes that never belonged to them in the first place. Jung called this purpose poisoning, when you mistake ego-driven desires for soul-driven calling. You think you want success, recognition, or achievement, but what you actually want is to feel worthy, safe, or loved. The problem is that external accomplishments can never fill internal voids. This is why spiritual awakening kills motivation so effectively. When you see through the illusion of the separate self, you also see through the illusion that external achievements can create internal fulfillment. Every goal you've been chasing suddenly looks like a sophisticated form of self-deception. Jung worked with a patient named Thomas, who perfectly illustrated this dynamic. Thomas had spent 15 years building a successful business, thinking he was motivated by entrepreneurial passion. But after a profound awakening experience, Thomas couldn't summon any interest in his company. "I built this business because I was terrified of being seen as a failure," Thomas told Jung. "Every late night, every sacrifice, every strategic decision was driven by the fear that I wasn't enough. Now that I can see this clearly, the whole enterprise feels like an elaborate house of cards built on quicksand." Jung helped Thomas understand that his loss of motivation wasn't a spiritual crisis. It was a spiritual liberation. Thomas was finally free from the unconscious fears that had been puppeteering his life decisions. But Jung discovered something crucial. You can't just strip away false purposes without replacing them with authentic ones. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the psyche abhors meaninglessness. If you don't consciously cultivate authentic purpose, you'll either relapse into ego-driven goals or remain paralyzed in purposelessness. Jung developed what he called the purpose archaeology process, a systematic method for excavating authentic calling from beneath layers of social conditioning and ego programming. The process begins with what Jung called desire discrimination, learning to distinguish between ego desires motivated by fear, lack, or social pressure, and soul desires motivated by love, abundance, or authentic expression. Ego desires always contain hidden because clauses. I want to be successful because then people will respect me. I want to find love because I can't bear being alone. I want to make money because I'm afraid of being poor. Soul desires stand alone without justification. I want to create. I want to help. I want to explore. They don't need external validation because they emerge from internal fullness. Jung found that most people have never experienced pure soul desires because they've been unconsciously motivated by ego programming since childhood. Spiritual awakening strips away the ego programming, revealing the authentic desires that have been buried underneath. But accessing these authentic desires requires what Jung called conscious waiting, learning to sit in purposelessness without panicking, allowing something deeper to emerge naturally. After years of research on post-awakening motivation loss, Carl Jung developed a precise three-stage framework for transforming spiritual emptiness into authentic purpose. Jung called this the psychological resurrection process, a systematic approach to birthing new motivation